The Bible is a treasure trove of stories, each brimming with timeless wisdom and profound truths. Among these, the genealogy of Jesus stands out not just as a record of lineage, but as a powerful testament to God's grace and purpose. Have you ever wondered why Matthew included such unexpected names, especially women, in this sacred list? Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, each of their stories carries layers of complexity, struggle, and redemption that challenge cultural norms and redefine faith. These narratives are not just historical accounts. They're living reminders that God works through the most unlikely individuals to shape His divine plan. Let's dive deep into these remarkable stories and uncover the lessons they hold for us today. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Don't miss out on the revelations we'll explore together. The importance of genealogies in the Bible. Genealogies in the Bible serve as more than mere lists of names. They are profound testimonies of God's faithfulness across generations. For the Israelites, these records held cultural, legal, and spiritual significance, affirming their covenant relationship with God. They were a way to trace ancestry, proving one's rightful inheritance of land or priesthood, and even establishing connections to the lineage of kings like David. Beyond historical accuracy, these genealogies encapsulated the unwavering continuity of God's promises to His people. In the Gospel of Matthew, the genealogy of Jesus takes on special importance, weaving together the threads of Old Testament prophecies. This lineage demonstrates that Jesus is not only the promised Messiah, but also the culmination of God's redemptive plan. The inclusion of key figures like Abraham and David highlights His fulfillment of covenants made with Israel's patriarchs. It is a striking reminder that God's plans, even when spanning centuries, remain steadfast and unbroken. Another critical aspect of biblical genealogies is their role in preserving identity. During times of exile or dispersion, they provided a sense of belonging and continuity for the Jewish people. Knowing one's lineage meant maintaining a connection to the sacred history of God's work. For instance, in Ezra and Nehemiah, genealogies were used to validate the return of priests and Levites to rebuild the temple, underlining their spiritual and national heritage. Remarkably, genealogies in the Bible do not shy away from including flawed individuals. Figures like Judah, whose actions were morally ambiguous, and Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, are listed as part of Jesus' ancestry. This intentional inclusion demonstrates God's ability to redeem broken stories and use them for His divine purposes. These records emphasize that no sin or human limitation can thwart God's plan for redemption. In addition to documenting historical lineage, genealogies carry symbolic meaning. The arrangement of names often reflects spiritual themes, such as the symmetry in Matthew's genealogy, dividing 42 generations into 3 sets of 14. This numerical design reinforces theological messages, such as Jesus being the ultimate king who fulfills divine order. These patterns invite readers to see God's hand not only in history, but in the details of Scripture itself. The presence of women in genealogies, particularly in Jesus' lineage, further illustrates their theological depth. In a patriarchal society, their inclusion was groundbreaking, pointing to God's inclusive nature. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary represent a tapestry of complex stories, of faith, struggle, and redemption. Their presence challenges societal norms and affirms that God's grace transcends cultural boundaries. Genealogies also reveal the unfolding of prophecy, tying the Old Testament to the New Testament in a seamless narrative. Prophecies concerning the Messiah's descent from David and Abraham find their fulfillment in Jesus, as detailed in Matthew's opening chapter. These connections strengthen the believer's confidence in the reliability and divine inspiration of Scripture, bridging the past with the promise of eternal hope. In a broader sense, Genealogies underscore God's sovereignty. They remind readers that history is not random but orchestrated by a divine plan. Every generation listed in Jesus' lineage, from patriarchs to ordinary individuals, plays a role in the grand narrative of salvation. This serves as a powerful reassurance that even in chaos, God is in control, guiding events toward his ultimate purpose. Moreover, genealogies encourage personal reflection on our place in God's story. While the Bible's genealogical records are specific, their broader message is universal. Each person has significance in God's plan. Whether through ancestry or spiritual adoption into God's family, believers are invited to see themselves as part of a much larger narrative that spans eternity. Finally, the genealogies challenge readers to trust in God's timing. The fulfillment of promises made to Abraham, David, and others took generations, teaching us patience and faith. Just as God was faithful to work through centuries to bring the Messiah, he remains faithful to his promises today. The genealogies remind us to look beyond the immediate and trust in the enduring nature of God's plan. Inclusion of 5 women in the genealogy of Jesus. The genealogy of Jesus presented in the Gospel of Matthew is extraordinary not only for its historical and theological depth, but also for its inclusion of 5 women. In a time when genealogical records typically focused on male lineage, the presence of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary is remarkable. This deliberate inclusion reflects God's intention to highlight unexpected individuals who played crucial roles in his redemptive plan. Their stories underscore the divine pattern of using unlikely people to fulfill his purposes. Tamar's inclusion is particularly striking. Her story in Genesis 38 involves deception and social stigma, yet her determination secured the continuation of Judah's line, leading directly to the lineage of Christ. By mentioning Tamar, Matthew draws attention to God's ability to bring justice and redemption from even the most complex circumstances. Tamar's faith and resilience serve as a reminder that God works through human imperfections. Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute, is another surprising figure in Jesus' genealogy. Her story in Joshua 2 demonstrates extraordinary faith as she protects Israelite spies in Jericho. Despite her background, Rahab's actions show her recognition of the God of Israel as the true God. She becomes an ancestor of Jesus, illustrating that faith, not social status or moral perfection, is what aligns people with God's purposes. Ruth, a Moabite woman, adds another layer of depth to this genealogy. Her story is one of loyalty and devotion as she chooses to follow her mother-in-law, Naomi, and embrace the God of Israel. Ruth's inclusion highlights the inclusive nature of God's plan, as she is a foreigner welcomed into the covenant community. Her marriage to Boaz, a kinsman redeemer, foreshadows the ultimate redemption brought through Christ. Bathsheba, referred to as the wife of Uriah in Matthew's genealogy, represents another complex story. Her narrative is intertwined with King David's moral failure, yet her inclusion points to God's ability to transform even the most scandalous circumstances for his glory. Bathsheba becomes the mother of Solomon, continuing the Davidic line that culminates in Jesus. This emphasizes God's power to redeem both individuals and entire legacies. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the final woman mentioned and perhaps the most significant. As a young, humble woman, Mary embodies obedience and trust in God's plan. Her role in bearing the Messiah demonstrates the ultimate act of faith and submission. Through Mary, Matthew underscores the miraculous nature of Jesus' birth, fulfilling Isaiah's prophecy of a virgin conceiving and giving birth to a son called Emmanuel. The inclusion of these women breaks traditional norms, showcasing God's unconventional ways of working through history. In a patriarchal society, their presence in the genealogy of Jesus challenges cultural expectations and elevates the role of women in God's redemptive plan. These women stand as examples of faith, courage, and divine purpose, each contributing uniquely to the lineage of the Messiah. By choosing these 5 women, Matthew also highlights themes of grace and redemption. Each of their stories involves moral complexity, social marginalization, or personal hardship, yet they are honored as ancestors of Jesus. This demonstrates that God's grace is not limited by human failures or societal judgments. Instead, He transforms their stories into vital parts of His salvation narrative. Furthermore, these women serve as a reminder that God's kingdom transcends boundaries of nationality, status, and gender. Tamar and Rahab were Canaanites, Ruth was a Moabite, and Bathsheba was likely of Hittite association. Their inclusion signifies that the Messiah's mission would be for all nations, uniting people from diverse backgrounds into one redemptive plan. Ultimately, the 5 women in Jesus' genealogy highlight the inclusiveness and transformative power of God's love. Their stories resonate with modern readers, offering hope that God uses ordinary, flawed, and marginalized individuals to accomplish extraordinary purposes. This theme invites reflection on how God continues to call and equip people today, regardless of their past or circumstances. Redemption through complex stories. The inclusion of women with complex and morally ambiguous stories in Jesus' genealogy reveals a profound truth about God's redemptive work. Each of these women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, faced significant challenges and controversies, yet their lives became critical to the unfolding of God's plan. Their stories illustrate that God does not shy away from human brokenness, but uses it as a canvas to display His grace and sovereignty. Tamar's story is one of perseverance amidst injustice. Deceived and abandoned by her father-in-law Judah, she takes a bold and unconventional step to secure her future and preserve the family line. While her actions might seem morally questionable, her faith in God's promises shines through. Tamar's story reminds us that God's redemption often arises in situations that seem hopeless, turning what appears to be chaos into a narrative of restoration. Rahab's narrative in Joshua 2 exemplifies redemption in the face of societal judgment. A prostitute living in a pagan city, Rahab's decision to hide the Israelite spies was an act of remarkable courage and faith. Her declaration, "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below," marks a turning point as she aligns herself with God's people. Rahab's inclusion in Jesus' lineage shows how faith can redefine a person's story, erasing shame and replacing it with honor. Ruth's story is one of loyalty and love, but it also involves profound loss and hardship. After becoming a widow, Ruth clings to her mother-in-law Naomi, declaring, "Your people will be my people, and your God my God." Her choice to follow Naomi to Israel and trust in the God of Israel leads to a life she could never have imagined. Through her marriage to Boaz, Ruth becomes part of the Messianic line, demonstrating that God redeems those who trust in Him, even in the midst of overwhelming sorrow. Bathsheba's story is perhaps the most tragic and controversial of all. She is often remembered for her connection to King David's sin, yet her life did not end in scandal. Instead, Bathsheba becomes the mother of Solomon, the wisest king of Israel, and plays a vital role in the continuation of the Davidic line. Her story highlights God's ability to bring beauty and purpose out of the darkest circumstances, transforming personal pain into a legacy of hope. Mary's story, while different in tone, also carries elements of societal judgment and misunderstanding. As a young virgin betrothed to Joseph, Mary's miraculous pregnancy brought immense challenges, including potential public disgrace, yet her faith in God's plan remained unwavering as she declared, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." Mary's story of obedience reminds us that God's redemptive work often requires trust and courage, even in the face of uncertainty. These stories collectively emphasize that God's redemptive plan is not limited by human failures or societal norms. Instead, He works through flawed and unexpected individuals to bring about his purposes. This theme resonates deeply with the message of the gospel, which proclaims that God's grace is available to all, regardless of past mistakes or present challenges. The complexity of these stories also highlights the human condition, filled with both triumphs and trials. They remind us that redemption does not erase difficulties, but transforms them. For example, Tamar's resilience, Rahab's faith, Ruth's loyalty, Bathsheba's endurance, and Mary's trust all point to the idea that God values persistence and devotion, even in the face of life's harsh realities. Modern readers can draw inspiration from these women's lives, recognizing that God's redemption is active in their own stories as well. Whether facing personal failures, societal judgment, or overwhelming loss, these examples provide hope that God can use every aspect of life for his greater purpose. Ultimately, the redemption seen in these complex stories invites us to embrace God's grace and trust in his plan, even when circumstances seem uncertain or difficult. Each life, no matter how broken or flawed, holds the potential to reflect God's transformative power. Breaking cultural and social norms. The inclusion of 5 women in Jesus' genealogy, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, represents a bold departure from the cultural and social norms of the time. In a patriarchal society, where men were typically the focus of genealogical records, the acknowledgement of these women is profoundly significant. It signals that God's redemptive work is not bound by human conventions, and that his kingdom operates on principles that challenge societal expectations. Tamar's presence in the genealogy is a direct challenge to societal norms. Her story, marked by personal tragedy and bold action, defied expectations for a woman in her position. By taking matters into her own hands, she preserved the lineage of Judah and fulfilled a divine purpose. This inclusion demonstrates that God values justice and perseverance over conformity to cultural standards, elevating Tamar as a key figure in the messianic line. Rahab's story further exemplifies God's disregard for traditional boundaries. As a Canaanite and a prostitute, Rahab would have been considered an outsider and unworthy by societal standards. Yet her faith and bravery in protecting the Israelite spies made her a pivotal figure in the conquest of Jericho. Her inclusion in Jesus' genealogy underscores that God's grace extends beyond nationality and social status, affirming the idea that anyone can be used for his purposes. Ruth's story breaks cultural norms in a different way. As a Moabite widow, she faced significant challenges as an outsider in Israelite society. Despite this, her unwavering loyalty to Naomi and her faith in the God of Israel led to her inclusion in the covenant community. Ruth's marriage to Boaz and her role in the lineage of Jesus highlight God's willingness to embrace those outside traditional boundaries, showing that faith and character matter more than ethnicity or origin. Bathsheba's inclusion challenges societal expectations by demonstrating that God redeems even the most scandalous situations. As the wife of Uriah and later the mother of Solomon, her story is tied to King David's moral failure. Despite the cultural stigma that might have surrounded her, Bathsheba becomes a crucial part of the messianic lineage. This act of redemption highlights God's ability to bring dignity and purpose to those marginalized by society. Mary, the mother of Jesus, represents perhaps the greatest break from cultural norms. As a young, unwed woman, her pregnancy could have resulted in public disgrace or even death under the laws of her time. Yet God chose her to be the mother of the Messiah, emphasizing her faith and obedience over societal expectations. Mary's inclusion as a central figure in the gospel story demonstrates that God often chooses the humble and unlikely to fulfill his purposes. Together, these women illustrate that God's kingdom operates on principles of inclusion, grace, and transformation. By breaking cultural and social norms, their stories reveal that God values character, faith, and willingness over status, gender, or societal approval. These narratives challenge traditional hierarchies and offer hope to those who feel excluded or undervalued in society. The inclusion of these women also highlights the justice of God, who often works through the marginalized to bring about his plans. Their lives remind us that true worth is not determined by societal standards, but by God's purposes and promises. This message is especially relevant today, encouraging believers to embrace diversity and reject cultural biases in their understanding of God's work. Furthermore, these stories serve as a call to action for modern readers to challenge unjust norms and stand up for those who are marginalized. Just as God elevated these women in the genealogy of Jesus, he continues to value and empower individuals who challenge oppressive systems and advocate for justice and compassion. Ultimately, the breaking of cultural and social norms in Jesus' genealogy points to the transformative nature of God's kingdom. It invites all believers to see beyond traditional boundaries and recognize the ways in which God's grace extends to all people, regardless of background, status, or societal expectations. Examples of perseverance and transformation, the stories of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary, are profound examples of perseverance and transformation, showcasing how God works through trials and triumphs to accomplish his purposes. Each of these women faced unique challenges, yet their faith and resilience allowed them to become integral parts of God's redemptive plan. Their lives illustrate that no situation is beyond the reach of God's transformative power. Tamar's story is a testament to perseverance in the face of injustice. Deceived by her father-in-law Judah and left vulnerable as a childless widow, Tamar boldly took action to secure her future. Though her methods were unconventional, her determination ensured the continuation of Judah's line, which ultimately led to the Messiah. Tamar's story demonstrates that God honors perseverance, even when it arises in the midst of complicated circumstances. Rahab's life is a remarkable example of transformation. As a Canaanite prostitute, Rahab might have seemed an unlikely candidate for inclusion in the lineage of Jesus. However, her faith in the God of Israel and her courageous actions during the fall of Jericho changed the course of her life. By protecting the Israelite spies, Rahab aligned herself with God's people, leaving her old life behind and becoming part of his redemptive story. Ruth's narrative is one of loyalty and unwavering commitment. Despite being a Moabite widow with few prospects, she chose to stay with her mother-in-law Naomi and embrace the God of Israel. Her perseverance in gleaning fields and trusting in God's provision ultimately led to her marriage to Boaz, a kinsman redeemer. Through Ruth, we see how faithfulness, even in the smallest acts, can lead to profound transformation and blessing. Bathsheba's story highlights God's ability to bring healing and purpose out of pain and scandal. Caught in a tragic series of events involving King David, she endured great personal loss and likely public scrutiny. Yet, Bathsheba became the mother of Solomon and played a significant role in the continuation of the Davidic line. Her life exemplifies how God can redeem even the darkest circumstances, transforming sorrow into a legacy of hope. Mary's journey is a powerful example of obedience and trust in God's plan. As a young woman, she faced the enormous challenge of becoming the mother of the Messiah, a role that brought both honor and hardship. Mary's response to the angel's announcement, "I am the Lord's servant," reflects her unwavering faith. Her story reminds us that perseverance often requires courage to embrace God's calling, even when it seems daunting or misunderstood. Each of these women's lives also underscores the transformative power of grace. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary all experienced situations that could have defined them by their challenges or failures. Instead, God worked through their circumstances, elevating their stories as examples of his redemptive power. Their lives invite believers to trust that no past mistake or present difficulty is beyond God's ability to redeem. These examples of perseverance and transformation also provide inspiration for modern readers. In a world that often values perfection and instant success, their stories remind us that growth and redemption are processes that require faith, patience, and trust in God. Whether overcoming personal failures, enduring loss, or standing firm in the face of adversity, their lives encourage believers to remain steadfast. Additionally, these narratives challenge the notion of worthiness based on societal standards. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary were all women who, by cultural norms, might have been overlooked or discredited. Yet God saw their faith and used them to accomplish His divine purposes. Their stories affirm that true significance comes not from human approval, but from being part of God's plan. Ultimately, these examples of perseverance and transformation remind us of God's unwavering faithfulness. They show that even in the most complex and painful situations, God is at work, weaving redemption and hope into the fabric of human history. These stories invite readers to reflect on their own journeys and trust that God can bring transformation in their lives as well. What professionals say about these stories? The narratives of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary have captivated theologians, historians, and biblical scholars for centuries. These stories are rich with themes of faith, redemption, and divine purpose, prompting deep analysis and discussion about their significance in the biblical context. Professionals across disciplines recognize their unique role in demonstrating God's inclusive and redemptive work throughout history. Theologians often emphasize the theological significance of these women in the genealogy of Jesus. Many highlight how their inclusion demonstrates God's ability to use flawed and marginalized individuals for His purposes. Dr. N.T. Wright, for example, points out that their presence reinforces the idea that Jesus' mission was meant to transcend cultural, social, and moral boundaries. Their inclusion in the lineage underscores the global and inclusive nature of the gospel. Biblical historians focus on the cultural and historical context of these women's lives. Scholars like Dr. Karen Jobes explore how their narratives reflect the patriarchal society of their time while simultaneously challenging its norms. The bold actions of Tamar, the faith of Rahab, and the loyalty of Ruth, for instance, serve as countercultural examples of how God elevates the voices and actions of women in significant ways, even within restrictive societal frameworks. Literary scholars examine the storytelling techniques used in these narratives. The intricate details and dramatic elements of their stories are often seen as intentionally crafted to convey deeper truths. For instance, Tamar's story in Genesis 38 is rich with irony and dramatic tension, which scholars argue highlights themes of justice and divine intervention. These storytelling methods are seen as tools to engage readers while conveying profound theological insights. Psychologists and sociologists also draw lessons from these stories, particularly in understanding human resilience and the capacity for transformation. Rahab's shift from her life in Jericho to becoming a member of Israel's community is often cited as an example of personal growth fueled by faith and courage. Such stories resonate with modern concepts of overcoming adversity and finding purpose in life's challenges. Professionals in pastoral ministries find these stories invaluable for teaching and counseling. They often use them to encourage individuals facing difficult circumstances, showing that God's grace is sufficient to redeem any situation. Ruth's journey from widowhood and poverty to becoming an ancestor of Christ serves as a powerful illustration of hope and perseverance, providing inspiration for those in despair. Feminist theologians bring a unique perspective to these narratives, celebrating the empowerment and agency of these women. Figures like Ruth and Mary are often highlighted as examples of women who acted decisively and faithfully in critical moments. These scholars argue that their inclusion in Jesus' genealogy challenges traditional gender roles and elevates the role of women in the biblical narrative, making their stories particularly relevant today. From a missiological standpoint, Rahab and Ruth's stories are often examined as examples of God's heart for the nations. Rahab, a Canaanite, and Ruth, a Moabite, demonstrate that God's redemptive plan was never limited to Israel alone. Their inclusion in the messianic lineage serves as a foretaste of the Great Commission, highlighting the universal scope of salvation. Ethicists and moral philosophers analyze the moral complexities of these stories. Tamar's actions, for example, raise questions about justice and the lengths one must go to uphold it. While her actions might seem controversial, they invite discussions about the interplay of ethics, faith, and survival. These stories challenge simplistic views of morality and encourage a deeper understanding of God's redemptive work through human imperfection. Finally, professionals across all fields agree on one central truth. These stories point to the character of God. Whether viewed through the lens of theology, history, or psychology, they reveal a God who is faithful, merciful, and sovereign. By working through flawed and marginalized individuals, God showcases His grace and His ability to redeem even the most complex situations, inviting readers to trust in His divine plan. As we've seen, the stories of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary are more than genealogical footnotes. They are profound testimonies of faith, perseverance, and God's redemptive power. These women remind us that no matter how complex or flawed our circumstances may seem, God can use them to fulfill His greater purpose. Their lives invite us to reflect on our own journeys and trust in God's plan, even when it defies societal expectations or personal doubts. What about you? Are you ready to embrace God's grace and step into your own role in His story? Let these narratives inspire you to persevere, transform, and trust in the power of redemption. If you found these insights valuable, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and leave your thoughts in the comments below.